Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second edition of the Angular Spring Camp. It's been a while since we gathered together at the Autumn Camp, but now we are back with renewed energy and another solid dose of knowledge for you. I'm Krzysztof Skorupka, excited to be your host for today's event on behalf of Angular Love team. And of course, huge kudos to the whole crew for putting these meetups together. If this is your first time joining us, our camps consist of three meetups, each featuring talks from some of the best experts in the industry. Another huge thank you goes to our sponsor, House of Angular. House of Angular is a software agency specializing in all things Angular. So if you have a new project on the horizon, or you would like to strengthen your existing team with additional hands, or maybe just you want a consultancy to see if your project goes in the right direction, you know who to call. As always, we are broadcasting live from Warsaw, Poland, and we would love to know where you are tuning in from. So be sure to drop your location in the comments and just say hi. And as for today's agenda, we have three amazing speakers. So first, Dawid Kostka will give us SSR challenges. Is your app in deep water or on solid ground? Then Jarosław Żolnowski with intriguing topic, lazy but fast. How taking it slow can speed up your app. And finally, Sonu Kapoor will give us an introduction to ng-optimized image, enhancing performance and user experience in Angular. As usual, we will wrap each segment with a Q&A session, so be sure to ask your questions in the comments, share your thoughts, connect with each others. We would love to hear from you. So, without further delay, let me introduce our first speaker, Dawid Kostka. Dawid is a Angular.love community member, very active one. He's a blogger, emerging speaker. He is into SSR topics, performance optimization, and accessibility. And apart from coding, he's also into rollerblading and other sport activities. So, welcome, Dawid. How are you doing? We cannot hear you, Dawid. I think you may be muted.
Oh, you should be able to hear me now.
Yeah, now it's better. So how are you doing, man?
I am doing really great today. I feel like it's my day.
Okay, I like this attitude. So before we start your presentation, I would like to ask you one question. I will ask it pretty much every speaker today. So let's start with you. So what is your most awaited feature from Angular 20?
So there are many great features that will be coming in Angular 20, but I think one of my favorite ones in this new version will be template string literals in the HTML. They will boost the developer experience so much, and I feel like I will use them everywhere. Another also great thing, and that is coming in the 20, is changing the zoneless. Previously, the zoneless was an experimental phase in the Angular, but now, since the version 20, it is becoming in the developer preview. So I think this will be a huge change in the Angular framework itself.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. So definitely a huge thing. So maybe since we are talking about hot new stuff, let me use this opportunity to ask you another question. Did you have a chance to have a look at this new selectorless proposed syntax? You know, the one that we could sneak peek in one of the Angular repository PRs?
Yes, I did. I've seen this one a few days ago on the Twitter and also checked out the RFC. I think that this new approach is a very controversial one, especially that we used to write directives and component in a little bit different ways for so many years. But I'm also seeing some advantages of this approach. So for example, we no longer have to specify the imports of our directives and components in components array, which I see a huge advantage of this whole solution.
Yeah, definitely a big thing. So I guess the biggest one, since the change of the control flow, the refresh of this syntax, I mean, to the templates, Angular templates. So yeah, I'm also looking forward to the RFC of this one. Okay, so yeah, I guess it's time for your presentation. So Dawid, the stage is yours.
Thank you. So let's get started, and I would like to start my presentation with a simple question to you, my audience, whether you have ever worked with the SSR before. My guess is that many of you may have not worked with the SSR because it's kind of not popular technology, especially in the Angular framework. Therefore, today we are going to discuss the current state of the Angular SSR, how we are doing, what are the new features, and what may be potential challenges when working with this technology in your applications. I am Dawid. I've been programming for around 8 years so far, and since 2 years, I have a pleasure to be a part of a project that utilizes Angular SSR on the production environment for around 2 years. My favorite JavaScript topics are for sure the bundle size and tree shaking. They are really useful in case of the SSR and whole performance optimizations. Besides that, I am also an angular.love blogger and developer at House of Angular, and that's pretty much it. So let's start this presentation with a very simple question, whether your application does actually need an SSR. And I would say that your applications often don't need SSR. SSR is useful everywhere where your potential customers and people that will be using your application don't know your product yet. So for example, let's say an SSR is an ideal choice for applications like blogs, e-commerce, or some small photo galleries. Thanks to the biggest advantage of the SSR ability to provide SEO per individual page, I think this is a really great choice for any applications of this kind. Another great thing that is here in the SSR is the quick initial load that will allow us to make sure that our users won't bounce out very early when they are opening our application just because they have a slow internet connection. So with that in mind, let's take a look what actually SSR offers currently in the Angular. And oh boy, I would say it offers a lot. There has been many developer previews so far and even more stable changes. As of right now in the version 19, we've got many stable features. One of them is hydration, which was a complete game changer in case of the SSR. Then we also received an event replay, which allowed us with both hydration to create incremental hydration. Another great thing that we hadn't back in the days of Angular 12 was pre-rendering. And I think it is a really great feature, which, for example, we utilize in our blog angular.love. And without it, I would say creating such application, especially with the static content that don't need to be rendered every time the request is made, I think pre-rendering is really good. And last stable feature, but not least, is that Angular material components completely support hydration since the version 18, which was not so obvious. For the things that are currently in the developer preview, I would say that there are also many exciting things. For example, the incremental hydration. Then we have support for translations from the Angular localized library. And this was a really huge change that many projects have been waiting for. Fortunately, we've got it in the Angular 19 as the developer preview. Another thing that I am excited about in case of the SSR is the RxJS operator pending until event, which blocks the stabilization of the SSR applications and allow us to fully create SSR applications that are zoneless. And last but not least feature is the hybrid rendering. And I would say that it is completely game changer for the SSR. And the SSR will look even brighter in the future, in my opinion, because we may expect a lot of new features. One thing is sure, that the Angular team tries to build a solution that will work on any JavaScript runtime. So we may also expect support for the Deno and Ban. Another thing that they will be experimenting with is the support for the Nitro.js tool that will allow us to streamline the deploy process of the SSR applications. And also, last thing that I would like to cover in this section is the improved performance. I've been following SSR for around 2 years, and every few months I see a new PR that boosts up the performance of the SSR by around 2, 3, and sometimes even 5%. That's accumulating, and Angular SSR is becoming faster with each day, which in my opinion is really good because I can already see it that my application is simply running faster. But that doesn't mean that SSR is fully complete yet. In my opinion, one thing that we are missing as of right now, which for example is available in the next, is ability to create our projects utilizing Angular SSR from starters. In case of the Next.js, we can create a project based on the blog template, e-commerce template, photo gallery template, or even small things like Stripe integration. This allows us to adjust our projects accordingly, and it's especially useful in case we are working on a smaller projects, which in my opinion SSR is especially good at. So with that keeping in mind, let's go to another section and let's check out potential drawbacks and challenges that we may experience when working with the SSR in our applications. I would like to start with the tip of the iceberg and come into the abyss. That means we'll start with the easiest and most common problems in the SSR and finish at these that are most complex. So I'm pretty sure the one thing that every one of you know when it comes to the SSR is that in case of the SSR, we are lacking the browser's API at the server side. There are many ways to don't access the window object, session storage, local storage at the server side. And in my opinion, the most effective way as of doing this right now is using the after next render hook, which only executes the code on the client side. The legacy approach was by using the is-platform browser or is-platform server functionality, depending on our environment. And last approach, which is one of my favorite for things like local storage and session storage, is creating services with different implementation for the SSR and local storage, so we don't have to even use the after next render hook. This is a really great thing. Another thing that you may experience when working with SSR is for sure the developer experience. You will quickly find that there are not that many applications that utilize Angular SSR, especially on the production environment, and our community of developers is, I would say, rather small. Because of that, sometimes we will have to dive into the source code of the Angular or ask the Angular team how particular things work, which may not be that beneficial, but I think it's okay because SSR is still growing. Another thing in the developer experience that I am personally lacking is the missing DevTools for the transfer state. I would seriously love to see the content that is transferred from the server side to the client side and then reused in the request, because as of today, I don't have such opportunity and a tool that would allow me to do this. Next, we also have a thing that is changing right now. For many years, since introduction of the hydration in the Angular SSR, which was a seriously breaking yet very performance change, our system got kind of blocked. Not every library and not every feature support the hydration, and because of that, we were lacking support, for example, for the Angular localized library, which has not supported hydration. We only, as I mentioned previously, received the support in the version 19. Then Angular material was also kind of issue because some of the components were also not supporting hydration until the version 18. And lastly, we had no official way to write applications that uses SSR in the zoneless mode until the version 19, which is the newest version of Angular. All of that showcases that the Angular SSR is still dynamically growing, and we can see that many of the things, even though they are working on them over the last couple of years, are still in a need and are still developing. So with that in mind, let's go into another section where we will discuss a very important thing in case of the SSR, which is of course writing correct HTML. Just because SSR compares and when it hydrates the content, it compares the content from the server side with the one that is on the client side. So we have to use the correct HTML code. For example, we have to use the t-head and t-body tags within the table. We cannot nest forms and anchor tags inside of one another. And we are not able to create a content on the SSR that renders based on the device viewport because we simply don't have that information. And in case we will try to break any of these rules, Angular will simply remind us that we have a DOM mismatch, something that our server-side content was rendered differently than the one that was rendered on the client side. But there are also cases where we've written our code perfectly and it had no errors, yet services like Cloudflare, for example, or other proxies and middlewares, or even browser extensions could modify our HTML response. As you can imagine, the issues of this issue there are many issues that can cause this issue, and debugging this DOM mismatch itself can take a long hours. As you can see here in this GitHub issue, some random folk, it took around 10 hours to fix this particular problem, which I am feeling because I've dealt with it many times. The good thing is that Angular will in the future improve the diagnostic of this error, so we'll be able to fix it much quicker. And when it comes to the fixing this particular DOM mismatch error, as I mentioned, it's the best for us that we write our correct HTML code. But as you may know, sometimes it is not possible, and we will have to write our code, for example, depending on the viewport, or we are just using an external library. In such cases, we can take advantage of the ngskip hydration attribute and skip the hydration for this given component, which, as you may know, sometimes is needed. For example, just because we have to use that shared library in our project, which renders the content based on the viewport, but we don't have the time to refactor this particular piece of code. Okay, moving on to the next section, and here we will discuss a very important thing in case of the SSR is, in my opinion, the external libraries. Picking an external library for a standard project that does not have SSR can be difficult. And in cases of the SSR, it's even more difficult and I would say even cumbersome. The libraries for the SSR have two major things that make them ideal or just don't use them. First of these things is DOM manipulation or viewport-based rendering. Any library that you use must not violate the correct HTML rule, which we discussed earlier, and it is really important. Another thing, which is even more important, at least in my opinion, is the loading performance and bundle size of such library, because you should pick only the lightweight libraries for your project. By comparing these two potential arguments why to choose or why not to choose a particular library, you are often limited. You're often finding that your options are limited. As a result of that, you have two options. Either you will write something from scratch or utilize the package on the NPM, which in the long term may not be beneficial. Just because you wanted to write code, some of the code quickly can bring you a long-term issues, especially in case of the SSR, which in my opinion requires the hardest performance optimizations in any Angular applications that are on the market. So I would rather say that you should think at least twice when choosing an external library, because this is that important, and here you may have not in the future the time to refactor this library, or simply refactoring it can be almost impossible because this will take so much time. Okay, moving on to the next thing that is related to the SSR, and I think many of you may know it, and it is the SEO. Any Angular application that uses SSR would likely need some search engine optimization. And in case you don't know it yet, you should get familiar with it, because in my opinion, it is the whole point of having SSR in your project. There are many tools that you can utilize to boost the SEO on your website, and just one of them is the title and meta description, which are quite easy to set, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with it. You can do it with the title or the meta service, and yeah, that's it. These services are really simple. Another great thing that you may want to implement in your application that utilizes SSR is, for example, the OG tags. They allow us to create a social media preview in our applications, for example, on platforms like Discord, Facebook, LinkedIn, whenever any of your users will paste the link there. They're also quite easy to implement. All you have to do is to inject the meta service and add the particular tags into the head of your response document. Sometimes in the OG tags, we can even define the details for for example, on the user page for our user and say that it has this first name, this last name, this gender, and overall we can even set its nickname. But for such things and including extra information for the search engines, there is even a better tool, and it's called the rich results. In case of the SSR, we can take advantage of standards like JSON-LD, RDF, and microdata to implement rich previews of our content that is present on the page in the search engines. So, for example, on the left side, you can see pad thai there. That showed up when we typed in the Google pad thai recipe. The good thing about the JSON-LD is that the Google instantly knows that our recipe is named pad thai. It takes 30 minutes to prepare, and it consists of particular ingredients, which, in my opinion, without having JSON-LD on your particular site, getting such information would almost be impossible, at least in the era before the AI came. So about the implementation of the JSON-LD, it is quite simple. All you have to do is to create a script tag and in the SSR inject it into your document head. That is pretty much it. All you have to do is also to insert the type and stringify the content of the JSON-LD schema, which you can find in the JSON-LD documentation. Summarizing the search engine optimization, there are also a few more things that you can implement on your website. These are the creation of the robots.txt file, which informs where the Google crawlers and overall crawlers can enter and where they cannot. So for example, you can tell them that they should not visit the 404 page and the cart page. Another great thing is having a sitemap XML file, especially in case of the big websites, where we want to make sure that every particular page in our application gets crawled and will be indexed in Google. Besides that, there are also obvious things like setting appropriate keywords in our particular pages and writing semantic HTML along semantic attributes, because it brings the most value to the Google that you give it the content that is present on your website in an easily understandable for its way. Okay, that is pretty much it for the SEO, and I think there are even more things that you can do. Now we'll move on to some random issues that you can bump into when working on the SSR. And we'll start with the Angular animations package. Just because of the bundle reasons, you will likely need to provide it asynchronously with the provide animations async package. But there comes an issue. Your animations on the site won't be executed until this package fully loads and executes, which obviously may take quite a lot of time. So for example, in case you have fading animation that comes from the opacity 0 to opacity 100, it may not be the best solution because your content will be invisible unless this package loads. And believe me, on the 3G internet, it can take quite a lot of time. So if I were you, I would seriously use the CSS for animations on your site because it's much more performant and easier to implement. Okay, another complex thing in case of the SSR is definitely the authentication. It gets really complex in case of the SSR because we have to read the request object and return the particular content based on this particular request. Overall, we get a lot of the conditional logic in our application, and we may also want to develop a custom transfer state solution because by default, Angular SSR won't cache the request with the authorization and proxy authorization headers. But in my opinion, the greatest con of the SSR is its cost. SSR applications compared to the client-side applications can be seriously costly just because they tend to have a lot of resources required in order for them to be performant. Firstly, we need a good runtime server. We would also likely need some in-memory database like Redis so we can cache the requests and don't render them over and over again. And things that we must not forget about is the performance of our site, so we would likely need CDN service like Cloudflare, and of course optimization service for the images, for example ImageX. So be sure to implement the SSR in applications that only actually need it, so you don't end up paying a bag of money just for applications that actually have not needed the SSR in the first place. In the next step, we'll have the transfer state issues, and I would say in case of the SSR, this may be problematic. In case you send more and more requests, your transfer state overall will grow, and sometimes it may happen that you get the duplicated content in your HTML code. So for example, let's say that you have a JSON LD endpoint, and it gets transferred to the client side, even though it shouldn't be. Just because we've inserted it into the script tag like we've seen previously, and we don't want to duplicate this request in our response. What can we do about it? The solution is quite simple. All we have to do is to implement filtering for our transfer state. We can do it as following. Firstly, we create HTTP context token and name it accordingly. I like the name ignore hydration cache. Then we implement the filtering for the transfer state in the provide client hydration. And lastly, all we have to do in this case is to ignore the hydration cache for the particular request. It is as simple as that, but remember to use it only on the requests that are actually duplicating the content. But there is also another bigger con when it comes to the transfer cache and biggest issue overall, I would say. Sometimes it may happen that your application is not becoming stable within the 10 seconds, as you can see below. And the drawback of that is that your request will be reused from the transfer cache unless your application will become stable. As a con of that and visual bug will be that your requests are not actually refreshing the data in your application, which in my opinion is a really bad scenario. The cause of it is likely some macro task that blocks the stabilization of your application, and you should be careful of it. And in my opinion, it is seriously worth to implement an end-to-end test, especially if you're working in a big team. As an example end-to-end test, it's, I would say, quite simple. All you have to do is to provide protractor testing utilities, and then in the test itself, you must go through each individual crucial page in your application and execute this get time until apps is stable method, which we'll discover in the next slide. And finally, what you have to do is simply to check whether your application becomes stable within given amount of time. So when it comes for the implementation of this particular get time until app is stable function, it looks like this. Firstly, we wait until the testabilities are available in our browser, and in case they are not available, we return the -1. In case they are available, we start the timer, and when the testabilities will say that our application becomes stable, we return the total time for our application to become stable. Believe me or not, but this test is seriously essential just because some of your teammates may be doing optimizations, even in not your application in case you're working in monorepo. And as a result of that, they may, even without their knowledge, break the transfer cache in your application, which have some tragic consequences. Okay, this is pretty much it when it comes for the transfer cache, and the stabilization issue is, I would say, it's seriously common. Last thing that I would like to discuss today is the biggest con of the SSR, or I would say most complex thing in the SSR, just because it is the performance of the SSR applications. You must lazy load as much code as you need because you want to have a pretty good scores in your application and you want your users to load your application really quickly. You must check your bundle size every now and then and see if your application is actually fast. Besides that, you also need to take care of the initial load and make sure that it is fast. And as I mentioned earlier, we have to optimize our images, load the fonts lazily. Every now and then, we should also be able to check our HTML and CSS size, and if possible, shorten it so it's not as long. And most important thing, let's use a compression algorithm on our servers. The best choice as of right now is the Broadly, which is completely insane when it comes for the compression ratio that we get. Okay, this is pretty much it, and I would like to finish this presentation with one thought in mind. Angular SSR may not be the best framework as of right now for implementing SSR, but it is definitely growing, and with the incremental hydration coming to the Angular, I think that we are in the better spot than ever to make this feature seriously useful and work with and face other frameworks, like for example Nest, in terms of the optimization of our applications. In my opinion, SSR in Angular is worth trying, and in the project that I'm working at, we are seriously happy that we've chosen Angular 2 years ago, where nobody of us know the future of the Angular SSR. Last thing that I would like to show you today is the downloads of the Angular SSR and ng Universal that you can see in this rose line, and they're growing rapidly. Angular SSR is becoming much more popular nowadays than it used to be before, and I'm seriously proud of this whole thing, because back then the Angular SSR was seriously not that popular, and they were little devs that could work with it. So yeah, that's it for my presentation, and now I will be taking up questions.
Okay, thank you, Dawid, for a great presentation with a lot of useful tips. So as you mentioned, now let's dive into the Q&A session. So if you haven't asked your questions yet, be sure to do this now. And let me start with the first question. I believe we already touched it a little bit, but it's like a frequently asked question. So maybe let's try to sum it up again. So it's from Sohail Ansari: when to use and don't use SSR.
So in my opinion, SSR is only useful in case you need search engine optimization. This is the primary case when you need to use SSR in your project, and without it, I personally would not use it. SSR can also boost up your initial loading of the application. That means the users will see your screen of the application faster, but in my opinion, it is most beneficial, as I said, when the customers don't know your project and they're entering it from the Google. So in that case, you want to make this application discoverable in Google and make it so fast that the user won't bounce out of your application and page just because it's loading slowly.
Okay, thank you for that. And we have another one. How does SSR work with defer at the template?
That's a very good question. And until introduction of the incremental hydration, SSR have not worked with the defer template, and that was a big con of the defer. Back then, the defer would just not render the content, and the SSR would return the HTML without the defer content. And now, since the introduction of the incremental hydration, we'll get the content rendered in the defer, so that's definitely a big improvement in case of the defer. So to sum up, in case of the use of the defer alone, the Angular SSR would not return the content inside of the defer template. And in case you are using defer along with the incremental hydration, Angular will return the content inside of the template and will hydrate it whenever the trigger that is set on the incremental hydration is met.
Okay, that's a great response. And let's get to another one from Dmitry Dreko. How do you usually measure performance for SSR apps?
That's a really good question, and that often depends on the performance that you want to get. In my opinion, there are two types of the performance. First, one of them is the runtime performance, which in my opinion is good in case of the SSR, but we are more caring about the performance of the initial loading. So for example, when we want to measure the initial loading performance, we can take advantage of tools such as Lighthouse and some of the internet services that actually use this Lighthouse under the hood to check with our routine whenever we make appear that our application is actually running fast. When it comes for the checking the bundle size alone, we have tools like Webpack Bundle Size Analyzer and Source Map Explorer that allow us to see how our application is doing in terms of the bundle size and what we can potentially eliminate from our initial load in cases of the JavaScript. I'm also often using the Control U tool that allows me to check the code that was sent in case of the SSR response, because in my opinion, it's really important to check it manually and see if it actually contains things that are not needed initially. So we can decrease the initial size of the response that SSR returns as much as possible.
Okay, so let's get to the next one. We have a couple of them, so let me pick one. Maybe that's the one from Gulam Asgar. Can you SSR an app using only standalone components?
Yes, you can, and I would say that is the way to do an SSR application in 2025.
Okay, so that's great. I believe we have two more questions. So maybe, Dawid, you can consider answering them asynchronously in the chat. That would be great because we need to move on.
Okay, I will do.
Yep. Thank you for that. And thank you for being with us today. That was a great pleasure. And I hope to see you in the future events. Take care and bye.
See you.
Okay, so before we move on to the next speaker, I would like to share something with you. So when talking to developers, bloggers, speakers, basically anyone from the Angular community, I often hear that sometimes it may, with all of what's happening in the ecosystem, it may be hard to keep up. So I can easily relate to that, to be honest. And don't get me wrong, this is not a complaint because it's exciting to see Angular evolving so fast. But I can understand that it could be a little bit overwhelming to keep up, especially if you don't have that much free time or you've been out of the loop for a while. So that's why I wanted to recommend you a free ebook, The Ultimate Guide to Angular Evolution. It describes all of the key features starting from Angular v14 to the newest release v19. And so it describes all of the key features, what problems do they aim to solve, and what benefits they bring. And on top of that, there are also some unique comments and insight from GDEs. So if you don't know this resource yet, I really encourage you to check it out. You will find the link in the chat. And yeah, let us know, what do you think about it? And now let me get to our second speaker, who is Jarosław Żołnowski. Jarek is passionate about the clean code, performance optimization. He's also sharing his knowledge through blog posts, talks. He is also very active in the social media, so you should definitely consider following him. And he's also the co-organizer of the Angular Catch-Up podcast and Angular Toronto Meetup. So hello, Jarek.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm great, thank you.
I'm really excited to have you here today. Finally, we meet at one of our camps.
Yeah, thank you for the great introduction. And I'll need to thank David for covering fully comprehensive the SSR topic, so I'll have less questions, hopefully.
Yeah, so, but before we move on to your presentation, let me ask you the same question I asked Dawid. So when talking about Angular 20, what is the most exciting feature for you?
Yeah, so there are several things I'm excited about. I don't want to repeat what David said, but what stands out to me the most is seeing the continued stabilization of some well-known feature. Like, I'm particularly thrilled about linked signals finally becoming stable. So for me, honestly, this feature has been a game changer. So one of my recent projects, I was able to reduce the code base by something like 40–50% simply by leveraging the power and reactivity of linked signals. So I'm pretty happy to see it stable. There are few other features, I believe, that become stable in version 20, like control flow syntax. So in my opinion, these new syntaxes are much cleaner, much more intuitive compared to their ng-for, ng-if counterparts, and they make the template logic much easier to read. So yeah, the stabilization of both link signal and new control flow are definitely my favorite ones.
Yeah, so totally agree, especially about the stabilization of signals, because that's definitely a game changer. Yeah, so maybe let me also use this opportunity so our viewers may get to know a little bit more about the behind the scenes of Angular Ketchup. So could you tell us what really inspired you to start this initiative?
Yeah, so, well, there were a few things coming together, I believe. So firstly, I'm genuinely passionate about Angular and the incredible community around it. So I found constantly keeping up with the latest news, features, discussions, and I realized that probably not everyone has a time to do that. And I wanted to create some engaging way for developers of all levels to stay informed about what is happening in the Angular world. So you might ask why podcast, why I choose that form, but I would probably not surprise you much. So I was thinking of something that you can turn on while driving a car, simple as that. Secondly, I enjoy connecting with people and having good discussions. So everyone who knows me knows that I like to talk, generally speaking. And podcast seems like a fantastic medium to bring together, interesting voices from the Angular community, share their perspectives, learn from each other and from their experiences. So I see my podcast as a place to catch up on the important stuff about the Angular, maybe discover some new things, and that's exactly why I called it Angular Catch Up.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that's really amazing job you are guys doing. But speaking of people and topics, so is there any key you use, to prepare the upcoming episodes, or is it really like, you see a new hot topic, it's like rather ad hoc or even freestyle? How would you call it?
Yeah, so when it comes to choosing the topics and guests for the podcast, so the main goal is to keep it relevant and informative for the Angular community, right? So we actively try to cover the most recent topics and discussion within the ecosystem. So this could be anything from the new Angular releases, experimental features, best practices, what's coming next, some kind of tooling updates and so on. So, it's more like based on whether the topic is hot. I don't see any kind of more general pattern there when we choose a topic. When it comes to the guests, so I specifically aim to invite top Angular developers, who are deeply involved with these topics. Mostly they are the authors of some particular features or libraries we are discussing. So we often reach out to the members of the Angular team to get first-hand information and insights directly from the source, right? And these conversations I observed are invaluable, means, they often share perspective that you won't find elsewhere. Plus, I found out that, our guests are usually kind enough to give us a little peek behind the curtain, sharing what's cooking in the kitchen, so to speak. So this allows me and our listeners to learn about some upcoming developments, preview what's coming next. And it's a great way for everyone, including me, to stay ahead and learn something from the best.
Yeah, definitely. That's really a unique value. So, but it's also kind of funny. I was talking a minute ago about, keeping up, and you are talking about being ahead. So, yeah, but different people are in different places, of course, in different situations. But that's great that everyone can find something for them. So, yeah, I guess it's time to get to your presentation. So, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Right, hopefully you see my presentation. So let's start it. So I'm thrilled to be here today to share some exciting features that will supercharge your app's performance. And today I'd like to tell you a story. I'm going to share quite a few stories with you today, actually, but not the typical fairy tale, but a story about the web performance and lazy loading. So let's start with the first one. Have you ever heard the story of the tortoise and the hare? Well, if not, then today we are going to reimagine that story in a context of web performance. So let's give it a try. Once upon a time, in a land of front-end development, developers raced to make their apps the fastest. And some of them actually believed that the only way to win the race was to preload everything. Much like the hare, they try to load everything at once, eagerly load every component, image, every bit of JavaScript, dumping the entire buffet onto user's plate before they even pick up the fork. Meanwhile, the REST developers, just like the tortoise, took a little bit different approach, loading only what is necessarily at the right time and avoiding this extra unnecessarily baggage, constantly delivering a smooth user experience. And in the end, just like in the fairy tale, the tortoise, the one who took this slower approach, crosses the finish line first. So today I'm going to show you how sometimes the slowest approach can be actually the fastest way to win the performance race. But before, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Jarek. I've been working with JavaScript for almost 18 years now, so quite a long time. I'm a lead technical architect. I love sharing my knowledge. Like Chris said, I'm the organizer of Angular Catch-Up podcast and coordinator of Angular Toronto Meetup. I'm also a mentor in Angular Space Community. You can find me on Twitter as well as on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me. That's all about me. So today we'll cover 4 core topics that are key to improve our web performance. So we'll start with image optimization. Then we'll talk about how lazy loading routes can dramatically improve the performance. We'll check the defer blocks in action and see why hydration makes server-side server-side render apps efficient and how incremental hydration can take it even further. And of course, we'll put everything to the test with a live demo. So finger crossed. I mean, what could possibly go wrong during the live demo, right? So let's start. And let's start with the definition. I imagine many of you are familiar with it, but for those who aren't, lazy loading is a powerful technique that allows us to delay the initialization of certain part of our application until they are actually needed. So instead of loading everything at once, lazy loading let us load different parts on demand. And this approach offers several benefits, like it can greatly reduce the bundle size and speed up the initial load time. So to give you some context for this, let's talk about some mentioned techniques, and let's start with lazy loading images. And again, let's start with another story. So let's imagine you are walking into a restaurant, ordering a food, and instead of serving you the dish you requested, the kitchen decides to prepare the entire menu. You know, every possible dish, every variation, all at once. So you sit there, hungry, waiting and waiting, while the chefs try to cook everything. And that's exactly what happens when an app loads every image upfront, you know, even the ones that user might never see. So browsers got this, I call it a bad habit of eagerly downloading every image the moment the page is loaded, even if they were burned down in some sections that user might never scroll to. So this is inefficient and definitely slow things down. Now, Angular has introduced a great feature for handling and optimizing images, ensuring they load faster without really compromising the quality. And the ng image optimize directive is in the center of this. Right, let's talk a little about this directive. I know that Sonu will explore it in details, but let's explore its attributes that help us speed up the initial loading time. So first, for images that aren't immediately visible, lazy loading is the way to go. And by applying ng optimized image, Angular automatically lazy load any images that comes into the viewport, meaning users don't have to wait for off-screen images before interacting with the page. And this small change makes a huge difference, particularly on slower networks where users no longer have to wait for images that they haven't even seen yet. And of course, not all images should be lazy. There's some critical or key images like the hero banner, logo types that should be prioritized and loaded as quickly as possible. And that's where the priority attribute comes in, ensuring that all the key images are loaded eagerly, meaning there is no delay, with the fetch priority attribute set to high, meaning the browser will prioritize to load of these images. And for the server-side render application, Angular will automatically generate this rel preload attribute, ensuring that the images will be loaded before the page is rendered, which speed up even more the initial loading time. Right, moving into the routing strategies that ensure efficient navigation. So let me tell you another story to illustrate this concept. So think of a Netflix, for example. Imagine you just want to watch a single movie, and instead of loading just the film you selected, the apps decide to download every movie in its library. Just in case you might want to watch something else. Why not, right? And again, instead of watching the movie you selected, you are just sitting there waiting for everything to load. And that happens when an Angular doesn't use the lazy loading for its routes. So with each lazy loading route, Angular automatically generates a separate JavaScript chunk, which means that user only has to download the essential code related with the specific route, nothing else. Now, to illustrate this concept, let's consider the following example. Let's imagine we have a route configuration that includes, let's say, 3 components, all set to be eagerly loaded. So without lazy loading, all components are bundled together in one big JavaScript file. Now, the browser has to process everything before rendering the first screen, which results, of course, long load times and sluggish experience. So all these 3 components will be downloaded right away, regardless of whether they will be used immediately or not. And in our scenario, all 3 components will get bundled to the main.js file, which takes right now something a little bit over 30 kilobytes. Now, with lazy loading, we only fetch the code when it's needed. So let's try to replicate the same example. But before, let's try to understand one thing. Implement lazy loading is very straightforward thing. It's built-in feature. So all we need to do is to just use the load component in our routing configuration, and that's it. So when user navigates to the specific route, only the relevant component will be loaded, which reduces the initial bundle size. Now, when we load the same 3 components from earlier example, we'll see a huge difference. So we can notice that our main.js file has decreased over 70%, which is awesome, right? We can also additionally see a lazy chunk files. The 3 lazy chunk files, which will be loaded only when user navigates to a specific route. All right, now, what if I told you that even the embedded views can be lazy? Angular introduced these defer blocks, which allow us to kind of load the parts of the particular page dynamically instead of rendering it at once. So again, to illustrate this concept, let me tell you a story. Again, let's try to imagine we are at the restaurant, this time with a multi-course meal. And instead of waiter dumping all the dishes you requested at the table all at once, crowding your space and making it overwhelming, they serve each course only when you are ready for it. So, you start with the appetizer, then you move to the main course, and finally, my favorite dessert arrives when I'm ready for it. Yeah, I'm not sure how about you, but I'm getting more and more hungry after each story, but yeah. So that's exactly how the defer blocks works in Angular, right? Instead of loading everything up front, it brings components only when they are needed. So this feature is especially very useful in application with lots of kind of non-essential content that doesn't really need to be loaded right away, but appears after some user interaction where some condition is met or when user clicks. Now I'm talking about components like, expanded cards, accordions, tabs, mega menus, chats, and so on. So in this section, we'll explore the defer directive and we'll discuss the triggers, a very powerful feature that allows us to control when exactly the deferred content is loaded. So let's start. Angular has made it super easy to implement the deferrable views. Now, all we need to do is to just wrap the specific component by the defer directive and will automatically delay its rendering until the specified condition is met. So in this particular example, the app recently watched component will be only rendered when the app is idle, which means there's no immediate task pending So this is the default behavior. If we'll not provide any argument into the defer directive, it will be treated as on idle. So those both examples are equal. Now, when we build application with that deferred block, Angular, similar to what we've seen in lazy loading routes, will automatically create this lazy loading chunk files for this deferred component. Now, Angular defers directive comes with several trigger options. So we can specify on idle, which means that we'll load the component when there is no immediate task pending, on viewport when the component, for example, scroll to the particular component, on interaction when user interact with some different part in the application, on over, similar but well over mouse, on intermediate. So we'll load lazily the component immediately right after all eager content has loaded. And on timer means after some giving time. Now, we can also specify a condition to load. So, we can load the component when the condition is met. In this particular example, we can load app recently watched component when the condition will return true. We can also combine multiple triggers. So in this particular use case, the app recently watched component will be loaded on user interaction, for example, click, specifically 5 seconds after this interaction. So this gives us a fine-grained control on when the defer blocks loads, allowing us to load component just in time rather than upfront. Right, moving to hydration. So I was trying to find the right example to illustrate what hydration is, and I think I found it. And here it is. So hydration is like awaking after a deep sleep, right? But for the web page. So we are technically awake, but not quite ready to face the world yet, not quite ready for interact with different people, or at least I'm not ready. So let's take a look and let's try to understand what's happening without the hydration. So without hydration, server-side render feels like getting a fancy looking delicious cake that you can't eat yet. So you have to wait and wait before you can actually take a bite and enjoy it fully. And you can admit that it's not the best experience, right? So in a typical server-side rendering process, the server generates and sends the HTML to the client. And this HTML, however, is completely static. So when the page first appears, user can see everything, but they can't really interact with it yet. So this interactivity comes a little bit later once JavaScript is downloaded and executed. Now, this can lead to some issues like content flickering and definitely slowing the initial loading time. Also, the user experience could be a little bit better because there's this delay between when content appears and when it's actually become interactive. So the longer the JavaScript takes to load, the longer the user waits to start interacting with the app. Now, let's talk about how things change with hydration. So with hydration, the same gorgeous, delicious cake becomes instantly ready to enjoy the moment it appears. So no waiting required, just cut and enjoy. And instead of staring on the static page while JavaScript setting up all these event listeners and all this configuration, hydration makes your app interactive right away, delivering this delicious user experience. And this means that as soon as the user receives the HTML, they can immediately see the content. So far so good, but we're not stopping there. So once the JavaScript loads, Angular kicks in, bootstrapping the app and making it fully interactive. So the magic here is that users don't have to wait for the page become interactive after seeing it. And everything happens much faster, loading quicker and improving the initial time. Now, enabling hydration in Angular is incredibly simple. So all we need to add is to add the provide client hydration provider during the application bootstrap. And that's it. Once it's done, we can immediately start taking the advantages of all its benefits. Now, we already know what hydration is and that hydration boosts the initial loading time. But incremental hydration push it even further. So instead of activating the entire application upfront, Angular can selectively hydrate only parts of our page the user interacts with, and the rest sections remain static until needed. So how does this incremental hydration work? So first, nothing changed. The application sends the pre-rendered HTML to the browser, so user can see the content right away. But the difference is that JavaScript is downloaded only for these individual components user interact with and activate when needed. So developers can set some conditions for when parts of the app should become interactive. And Angular provides a variety of triggers to control hydration behavior, similar to what we've seen in the deferrable views. So we have on idle, on viewport, which hydrates the component when it comes to the viewport, on interaction, so hydrates the component when user interacts with it, on over, when user over or focus on it, on timer, interact the component after some set delay. So for example, on timer 2 seconds, hydrate after 2 seconds. When means hydrates component when specific condition is met. For example, we can use this condition to check, if the user is logged in, then hydrate the content. And hydrate never means prevents component from being hydrated at all. It's very useful for non-interactive static content. So to enable incremental hydration, all we need to do is to add this with partial hydration argument to our provide client hydration provider. And from there, we can start using the defer directive to control when components are hydrated. Now, here we can see the incremental hydration in action. So the page is instantly rendered on the server, but we hydrate on over. So when we over the mouse, the JavaScript for each movie is loaded, and this way we can postpone the unnecessary script execution. All right. Enough slides, it's time for action. So let's walk through each technique and let's test them in a real Angular app. So hopefully at the end we'll see, how much faster app can be when we will be a little bit lazy. So let me present you the app I have prepared. All right. So I built a simple app that displays the movies within two main routes, the home route and the movies route. So the home route displays two sections, top rated movies and recently watched section, which is below this top rated movies. The movies route shows all available movies. So when we click on each movie, we can see an additional details. We can also mark movies as watched. For example, let's mark the Pulp Fiction as watched, and we can add it to the favorite. Once we do that, we can see our Pulp Fiction film has been added dynamically to the recently watched section. And that's pretty much all. Now, let's quickly look at the implementation of this application. So the entire app is built using the latest Angular, which is 19.2.6. The navigation is handled in the toolbar component with 2 buttons that navigates us to the home and movies routes using the router link. The home component loads the top-rated container and recently watched components. Both components are quite similar, so they fetch movies data from the store here and filter all movies based on some slightly different criteria. So the top-rated considering the rates and returning us 4 top-rated films. The recently watched considering this is watched flag and return only watched films. So both components based on the app movie component, which is presentational component, and this component expects 2 inputs signal. First is the movie itself. The second is the flag is priority, which is default set to false. So we are using this flag to determine if image is loading or to determine what's the strategy for image loading. Our second route loads the movie list component. This movie list get all movies from the store, loop through each movie and display the movie details. Nothing special here. So movie details displays all the details about the film, the picture, which is whenever it's favorite, whenever has been watched, title, recent release date, gender, and once we clicked on this arrow button, we additionally attach this app movie expanded, which it's more about to display the cast and the description. So that's all. Let's now build the application and let's check in the Lighthouse what's the initial score for our application. So I'll use the HTTP server to run our dist folder on the browser, and it's running on the port 8080. So hopefully it will not be close to 100 because probably I'll not have anything to improve there, but live demo is a live demo. You'll never see. Yeah, it's 60, so could be better, but it's not that bad. So let's check how we can improve our application to get higher score in a Lighthouse. So first of all, I will run it locally first. All right. So first of all, after running, we'll see that here it is. We'll see that ng-optimize image directive returns us an error because it detected that some images as part of the LCP element and was not marked as dirty, which is very useful. Let's fix that first. So I believe it's about the top-rated images because this part is not part of LCP. those images which are preview of each movie should be prioritized because users should see those movies right away. So let's go to our top rated movies and let's say, hey, I would like to set this is priority to true. And that's it. Let's try to verify if the error gone. Right. So right now we can see, hopefully the font is big enough. We can see that after we setting a priority images, we have loading set to eager and fetch priority set to high, while these bottom images are by default lazy loaded, right? So those would be lazy loaded, those would be prioritized and loaded by the browser as a first. Then what else we can see? We can see, for example, that our main bundle has 54 kilobytes and there is no any lazy loaded chunk, which means all the routing is set to be eager. So let's change that. And let's say we would like to use the load component, which import the movie list and movie list component. Then we'll load the movie list component. All right. Now, if we'll take a look a little bit closer, we'll see that when we navigate to the movies route, this additional chunk will be loaded. And right now, our main bundle has been decreased to 29.1 kilobytes, which is awesome. So not much work, but a great effects. What else can we do? Well, because this extended part, this additional information is not like a very essential content that has to be rendered immediately right away after page is loaded. We can defer this content and load it separately. So let's try to do this. So we can see that this content is loaded here. So now we can say, hey, please load this content on interaction with this expand element, right? And now when we'll build our application, I would like to demonstrate what's the result of it. And we'll run it into the browser on port 8080. Awesome. When we'll move into the movies route, we'll see that after expanding, an additional chunk is loaded, which is great. Maybe it's not a big chunk, but this is just the example. Imagine that you have like a mega menu with lots of different links. It would be definitely a bigger chunk. So last thing that we can improve is our main homepage. So as we can see, after starting a homepage, we can see only the top rated movies, but we can't see recently watched section, right? So what we can do is to utilize the incremental hydration and lazy load this bottom section once the user scroll to it. Means this section will be entered into the viewport. So let's try to do this. All right, we have our home component. We are loading both components eagerly. Now I would like to defer hydrate on interaction. Yeah. All right, and because we are using the hydration, it would be very nice to have SSR application, right? So let me find, yes, here. Let's add the Angular SSR library. Hopefully it will not take forever. All right. Right, so now we can see we have provide client hydration. By default is with event replay. We would like to have this one with incremental hydration. All right, so now, all is set up, and let's run our application. So to run our application, when we add the package SSR, Angular has generated a separate script for us, which runs on port, I believe, 4000. Or not. Oh, yeah. I believe we need to build the application first. So let me remove this folder. Let's build the application once again, and let's run it with the server-side rendering. All right. Now, yes, it's working. Now, we can see that, let me refresh. We can see that many chunks are loaded. However, my mistake, not on interaction. When this section comes to the viewport, I'm sorry, this is the part of the live demo. So let's rebuild the application and let run it once again. All right. Now, hopefully that's the last time. Yes. So once we scroll, we can see this additional chunk is loaded, right? And this additional chunk is responsible for this section, basically. So we can split this entire page on multiple different pieces. I call it slice the elephant, basically, and load each part when it's actually needed. So now, after these few improvements, let's verify how the Lighthouse score improved. Hopefully, it's close to 100. I doubt it would be 100, but we should observe some improvements. Yes. So as you can see, by doing only a few operations, which takes a few minutes, we almost double our score, which is awesome, right? All right, let's go back to our presentation, and I believe that's it. So I hope we prove that, slowing things down in the right way, we actually speed things up. And by lazy loading images, routes, components, optimizing hydration, leveraging incremental hydration, we make our apps faster, lighter, and more efficient. So go be lazy, build incredible, fast apps. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Arek. That was a nice presentation with a lot of interesting analogies and a live demo, which is always tricky. So really appreciate it. So now let's jump into the Q&A session. So let me look. Okay, I believe we have one question which was kind of answered already in the chat, but it would be good to highlight the difference and sum it up. So from Saida Ansari, is defer condition same as ngIf to load components lazily?
Not really. So the third block is splitting our bundle into two separate chunks, while ngIf is structural directive which hides the part of our template and display it once the condition is met. So it's still the same part of the same chunk, basically. The ngIf does not split the bundle into two separate parts. Hopefully I did answer this question.
Yep, I think so. And then we have another one from Gulam Asgar. How can libraries like Canvas.js be loaded and rendered immediately in Angular when they only initialize after user interaction due to hydration or hidden state? For example, tabs models. Yeah,
Okay.
take your time. It's kind of a long and complex question.
Well, I'm not the expert. I haven't used actually the Canvas.js library, but I think it's like more general question where how to initialize this library after user interaction due to hydration or hidden state, right? So I think there's some, probably I would use some general dynamic imports or something like that. I'm not sure, each library has different API, and each library could be initialized in a slightly different ways, basically. There's some libraries or some packages that shouldn't be initialized multiple times. So we need to be aware that once we are using the defer blocks or hydration, we are not initializing the same thing multiple times. I'm talking specifically about the newest HTTP resource, for example, which should be initialized only once and then just call in the application. I'm not sure how the Canvas.js, to be honest, is initialized, but if it's through the import, I would go for like dynamic imports or so.
Yeah, I guess that's probably where we should start. So I hope that this answers the question. And there is one more. I'm not really sure, but let's try it. From Surbi Apatyai, do we need separate API for defer components?
What does it mean? Do we need separate API for deferred components? So deferred components are the same components, but just lazy loaded, right? So the API for each component in Angular is exactly the same. It's more about how the component is loaded and how the component is treated by the browser, rather than we need to implement anything specific inside this component, right? So defer directive allows us to slice this particular component or take this component from the main bundle, create from it a separate lazy loading chunk, and load this chunk into the browser once it's needed, when the condition is met or when there's any interaction. So there's no any specific API for lazy loaded components.
Okay, right. Hopefully we answered the question. And I believe we've reached the end of our Q&A session. So again, thank you, Jarek, for being with us today, for the great presentation. And yeah, I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation. And definitely see you soon. Ciao, bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, so now it's time for our last speaker, who is Sonu Kapoor. And Sonyu is Angular GDE, a Microsoft MVP, and he is also a co-host of Angular Catch-Up podcast and also a co-organizer of Angular Toronto. So, hi Sonyu.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. What about you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, that's our pleasure. So let's start with the standard question I've asked everyone today. So what is the Angular 20 feature that you are excited about the most?
Yeah, I would have to agree with the other speakers already. They took, all the big points that I was going to mention as well. So it has to be the continued evolution of, I think, the control flow syntax, right? So we saw that in Angular 17. It brought in a more declarative approach to templates. And I'm looking forward to Angular 20 to pushing that even further, especially with maybe a tighter integration with signals, right? So signals are already changing the way we think about reactivity. And in Angular, I think the next step is truly like the reactive template syntax. So I think that would be a big game changer for the developer, for developer experience, right? Other than that, I'm also, watching the progress around zoneless, right? So once that is in, we're talking about performance gains, simpler mental models, something definitely enterprise teams like mine are craving for, right?
Yeah, that's well said. And it seems like we all share the same perspective here. So yeah, looking forward to Angular 20. So yeah, since I already asked Jarek about the Angular Catch-Up podcast, maybe I can ask you, Sonia, on the other hand, about the Angular Toronto. So what's next for this community? Are there any exciting plans ahead?
Yeah, so we know Angular itself is already evolving very fast. And I think so is our community. So at Angular Toronto, we're trying to focus on like architectural shifts and how they play out in real world. So for example, our upcoming virtual series dives into the evolutionary architecture, covering how teams are moving from services and observables to signals, maybe even adopting fine-grained reactivity and like maybe even using SSR, and going all the way to zoneless setups, right? We also want to try to open up the floor to the community for lightning talks, like war stories and use cases from real applications. I think it's all about learning how Angular is changing, but we also make sure that we want to give everyone a voice, within that evolution that's happening right now.
Yeah, that's great. So definitely fingers crossed for the Angular Toronto.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
yeah, I guess we can get straight to your presentation right now. So the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, hey everyone. Thank you for joining my session today. So today we're going to dive into what I think it's an exciting topic, and Jarek already kind of touched on it a little bit. So we'll be speaking about the ng optimized image directive in Angular. We'll explore the powerful directive, how the directive can significantly enhance your performance and user experience of your Angular applications, right? Yeah. So before we get started, let me introduce myself a little bit. So my name is Sonu Kapoor. I'm a senior Angular developer consultant. I have worked with various top Forbes 100 companies and helped them with their Angular projects. And like Chris said, I'm also an Angular GDE and a Microsoft MVP. In the past, I did contribute quite a bit to the Angular framework and created over 100 pull requests. And yeah, I'm also co-host of two podcasts, actually. One is the Angular Catch-Up, and one is a generic podcast with Santosh on tech topics. Cool. All right, so coming to today's topic, here's what's we're gonna cover. We'll start with a brief introduction on the directive, followed by an overview of the problems with traditional image handling. Then we'll talk about some key features. And I don't have a demo like Jarek had, but the screenshots and everything I showed, I've built an application out of that you can download from this repo here that you see on the screen. Okay, so the directive was introduced in Angular 14, so quite a while ago, and it was fully operable in 15. It's also one of the most underused features I find in many Angular projects, and I've seen many of them. So the main goal of this feature is to improve performance and enhance also the user experience. And I think that aligns really well with Angular's mission, to provide developers with powerful tools that makes development of web applications a lot easier. So you may be wondering, what's the problem with traditional images, right? So traditional image handling in a web application often leads to significant issues like slow load times that can frustrate users and also negatively impact your site's performance. When the image doesn't load, it just looks bad on your website, right? High bandwidth is another concern, especially for users that have limited data plans or are in regions with slower internet speeds, right? So your best image that you're showing on your website might be good for high-speed users, but when you have limited data, it might take a long time to load. So the directive can help definitely with that. And then also, ensuring that images are responsive and look good on all devices can also be quite challenging, right? It requires manual adjustments and multiple image versions and so on. And you may even have to write code to understand on what device you are, and then depending on the screen size, you could load different versions of the image. So that's also one of the concerns, right? So let us see how this directive can help us. So unlike the standard image element, right, the directive can automatically handle image resizing, lazy loading of the images, and it can use placeholders when your image is still being loaded. So that ensures that users, for example, always receive either the most optimized version from the device, or they see a placeholder, or they see something else that is happening while the image is being loaded, right? So this on its own gives you a much better user experience, as the user can see that there's still something happening on the screen. So let's start with lazy loading, right? So the directive can be used to defer the loading of off-screen images until they are needed. And that again reduces your initial load time and also improves the perceived performance of your application. So all you have to do is add the loading attribute and set it to lazy, right? So while this actually sounds awesome, you should only use this for images that are not in the viewport, okay? So if you're using images that are above the fold, then you do not want to use this at all. In that case, you want to eager load the images, as you probably want to show them as soon as possible. And by default, lazy is set to all images that are not marked as priority. So you have to be really careful with that. Jarek was showing a demo about that previously, and you could see it there. Yeah, so as I mentioned, eager loading. When the image is marked with priority, then the fetch priority is automatically set to high, and that causes the image to be loaded eagerly. And that means, we're giving instructions to the browser to download the image as soon as possible. So we're helping the browser to make that decision. And when you set the fetch priority, it will also improve the LCP, which is the largest contentful paint. So LCP is also known as the loading metric, used to identify how long it takes for the page to load. And most of the time, this is done by looking at the largest bit of content that is loaded. In many cases, that is an image element or an H1 element or something like that. And because we are talking about images, right? So images take much longer to load than text. So the browser needs to find the image, it needs to download it, and it needs to display it, right? And to help the browser, we can set the priority. But to understand really what that means, right? Setting the priority. Let's first see how this looks if we don't use the priority at all. So consider the following image element. By default the priority of this image will be low, right? So we're not using any directive here. It's just plain HTML, right? And so when you can see that in the priority column of your network tab here, right, marked with number 2, that the priority is set to low first and then to high, right? So normally you would only see high unless you enable the big request rows option that you see under number 1. So this is really useful because we understand now that, first the browser is doing a lot of additional work, right? So first it sees the image, it marks it at low, and then it knows that the image is part of your viewport, and then it sets it to high, right? So this is where the priority attribute comes into play, right? So if we add the fetch priority now and set it to high, then we're telling the browser that this is an important image and we want you to download it as quickly as possible. Okay, so when you look again at the priority column, you will see that the initial and final value is set to high. Okay, so that means the browser has to do less work to show the image, right? And again, this is really useful for images that are above the fold, right? Your banners, your logos, or anything that you want to appear as soon as possible. Yeah, so under the hood, this is what happens when when priority is set. And to use this, right, all you have to do is obviously first change the source attribute to ng-source, and then we just add the priority attribute. You can see that here on the left side in the second code snippet here. And another cool thing about this is that if you're using the directive, with an image provider, and you're not setting the priority, but your image is above the fold, then the directive will throw an error saying that the image should be marked with priority. And I think this error message is really useful to make sure you do not forget that. And Jarek had a nice demo on that one as well when he was showing the error in the console, right? Okay, so let's move on to the next feature of placeholders. So placeholders, the placeholder attribute helps you essentially to manage how a placeholder can be used while the image is loading or still being fetched. And this on its own provides a much better user experience. And if you're using a CDN like Cloud Binary, right, that supports multiple images, image resizing, you should automatically receive a low resolution image for the placeholder, right? And you don't need to set any value for that attribute, right? So while the image is still downloading, you will see a low resolution image, and I think that on its own gives a much better user experience. But if you want to use a completely different image, right, then you can also set the placeholder to an encoded version of the image in base64 format. And here's how this could look if you used a base64 spinner. So one thing to keep in mind is that these base64 images should be kept small. Otherwise, you will get an error. And this is the error you would get, right? So the Angular team, takes developer experience very seriously. So when you use an image that is larger than 4 kilobyte, you will get an error message like this. And the team recommends to keep the images smaller than 4 kilobyte. So one thing you will notice is that the base64 image here is quite blurry, right? So it's actually not the image itself, it's the directive that is doing this. I think it gives a nice user impression that the final image is still being loaded. But you can also disable this effect. If you do not want to have this blurriness, you can disable it by using the placeholder config and setting the blur key to false, right? So this is how it would look. And this is how the base64 image itself actually looks, right? So yeah, this completes the priority and placeholder topic. Now in the next section, we'll speak about loaders, which I mentioned earlier, like Cloud Binary, right? Which is a CDN provider. So the benefits of such a provider, is that it will automatically create multiple versions of your image. And with the help of the directive, the browser can then download the right size for your device, right? And to use this, you need to set the loader in your provider's array using the provide. So here I'm using Cloud Binary, right? A Cloud Binary, and you would have to use the appropriate function for that. So Angular gives you 5 pre-configured loaders that you can use. And here's the list of providers in case you're wondering, right? But also, if you want to use your own provider, you can do that as well. So for that, all you have to do is provide the image loader DI token and a loader function that takes the image loader config as an argument and then returns the absolute URL of the image, right? So you import both of these from the standard Angular common package. And additionally, there is a loader params parameter, that can be used to pass anything from the directive into your loader function. And here's an example how that would look, right? So we just set the loader params input and define the value we want to pass through. So in the loader function, then we use this property to modify the behavior of our loader, right? So in this case, we're adding the rounded corners query parameters to our URL, right? So this way you can essentially pass anything you like and pass it along to the final URL for the image. One more thing to get the loaders to work is that you need to add the pre-connect links to your index.html. So pre-connect again gives the browser instructions to download critical resources as soon as possible. And without pre-connect, the browser again has to do additional work to discover them. And again, Angular helps you to not forget that, right? So the directive will throw a warning into the console, reminding you to add pre-connect into the head of the document. Cool. All right, moving on into the next section. So we'll be speaking about responsive images and how they can save a lot of time. So the directive will automatically set the source set attribute with the necessary information which tells the browser to download the best possible image, based on your user's device. And this can work with or without the size attribute, right? So if you set up your image without the size attribute, then the directive will automatically generate the density dependent source set. So that means that the 1x image, will be automatically downloaded by the browser on low pixel density screens, and 2x for high density screens. And what that means is that a higher density, or also called device pixel ratio, DPR, on screens generally means a higher pixel count, which also means a better image quality, right? So here we can see that the source set is set automatically, right? One for 400 and one for 800, right? So these are the two source sets that the image will contain when you inspect the element. So to give you an example of a DPR, right? Most newer iPhones even have a DPR set to 3. Android, for example, is way ahead, and there is either 3 or even higher, right? So if we look at our previous example, right, we can see that in the left screenshot, the image downloaded is 400 by 400 when the DPR is set to 1. You can see that at the top, right? And when the DPR is set to 2, you automatically get a much better image. You can see that in the right side, which is the 800 by 800 image, right? So you can imagine on the iPhone you would get the left image, and on the Android you would get the right side of the image. So adding the sizes has a similar effect. So here I'm setting the image to be 80% of the viewport, and it will automatically generate the source set for all available breakpoints. So here is the list of breakpoints, if you're wondering. So this is what it's going to generate for you. And this is how it's going to look inside your element, right? So I think this is, again, right, very helpful, as you don't have to worry about providing all the different sizes yourself for each breakpoint, right? And as you have previously seen, the browser will automatically request the image that fits, your device, and you don't really have to worry about writing any additional code to handle this. And yeah, if you only support a subset of breakpoints, then you can also customize this list by providing the image config DI token to your provider. So this will then generate the source set only for the given breakpoints. And you can also, of course, define your own source set using the ng source set attribute on the element itself. So one of the common use cases is when you want to use media queries to control the image size, right? So one of them is, for example, you want to render multiple columns on the desktop while rendering only a single column on mobile. So here's an example. So the directive will use 100 view width as a factor to download the image on a viewport with maximum 768 pixels. Right, you can see that in under sizes. And otherwise, we want to use, otherwise it will use 50 view width, right? So what that means is that when you have two columns, when two columns are displayed, then the images will be smaller because you have less space. And when it's a single column, you will get a larger image, right? So setting the sizes with media queries can be quite helpful. And you can see here on the screen that if I resize the window, right, the Angular directive automatically replaces the image with a different size, right? And yeah, that's it. I hope this presentation was useful. And again, you can find the examples under my repo here in the footer, or you can connect to my main repo here and find also other examples. And please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, Sonyu, thank you for the great presentation. And now let's dive into the Q&A session. But I don't think we've got any questions yet, so that's the last chance to ask them. And in the meantime, let me ask one from my side just to clarify that. So would you consider applying ng optimized image pretty much to every image in the application, or rather consider it case by case? Sorry, Sonyu, could you hear us?
I'm having some trouble hearing you. Okay, I can hear you now. Yeah, I can see you now.
Okay, so
sorry about that.
Yeah, so I was saying that I think we don't have any questions yet, but I might have one just to clarify this in the meantime. So would you consider applying the directive and the optimized image to every image in the application, or maybe rather consider it case by case?
Yeah, I think I would consider it case by case, right? I would especially apply it to images that are above the fold, right? Because I want those to be loaded as soon as possible. And then I would apply it to those images as well that are not in the viewport actually, and make sure that they are lazy loaded, right? So it's always case by case. Don't take everything as thumb of rule that you should apply them as soon as something is available.
Yeah, that's great. And we have another one from Gulam Asgar. What limitation does ng optimized image have with external CDNs?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of any limitations with CDNs itself, right? So they work pretty well. The only limitations I know with the directive itself is about the sizes, right? So you always need to provide a size. Otherwise, the directive does not work. It's actually a requirement to provide the sizes. But CDN itself, I'm not aware of any limitations.
All right. So I guess that would be it for the Q&A session. So again, Sonyu, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for your valuable contributions. And yeah, I hope to see you soon. And take care. Bye. Okay, so that's all we had for today. But at this point, let me remind you about one thing. We are always open to your contributions. So if you would like to start writing some blog posts for Angular.love blog, you are more than welcome. So you will find the link to the form in the chat. And thank you for being part of our community, for being with us today, for your great attendance. And our next meetup will be held online on May 22nd at 6 p.m. You can expect another set of great speakers, Mateusz Stefańczyk, Fanis Prodromu, and Enea Holari. So we'll discuss a lot of topics, including Angular 20. So be sure to join us. And until then, follow us on the social media. Keep coding, stay curious, and see you soon. Bye.